Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on using instructionally sensitive assessments to measure teacher effectiveness. I'm Elizabeth Greniger, and joining me for the next 2 hours this afternoon is Dr. James Popham from the University of California at Los Angeles. I'll be giving you a little more of an overview of Jim's background in just a moment, but before I do that, I'd like to find out who's in our audience today. You'll see a poll come up onto your screen, and we'd like you to select the role that best fits the role you serve. Great to see a wide range of folks joining us today. Wish we had a few more school-based folks, but I know that's a challenge sometimes. See, we have quite a few researchers and policy folks in the audience. And I think the topic lends itself to be interesting for all who are in attendance, and Jim will certainly do his best to answer your questions throughout, and we encourage you to ask your questions in the parking lot and through the polls. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Jim Popham. Jim is a nationally recognized expert on educational assessment. For 30 years, he's taught courses in instructional methods for prospective teachers, as well as courses in evaluation and measurement for graduate students at UCLA. He was recognized by UCLA Today as one of UCLA's top 20 professors of the 20th century. I think you'll find out why today. He is the author of over 30 books, 200 journal articles, 50 research reports, and 175 papers presented before research societies. Jim's most recent book, titled Evaluating America's Teachers, Mission Possible, ? Was published by Corwin in 2013. And he has several other books which you can see up there on the screen. And we hope you'll check some of those out if you haven't already. And at this time, I would like to turn the presentation over to Jim.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And hello, everyone. I'd just like to underscore one thing that Elizabeth said in the introduction, that I had received recognition as one of the top 20 professors of the 20th century. I would like to point out that that was a complete 100-year century. That was last century, not this current abbreviated one, the big, long one. And I just recognize the implications of that honoring. Listen, folks, I received this morning an announcement, I guess many of you might have, from the organizers of this webinar. And they indicated they were thrilled that I was taking part. Now, thrill is probably a little excessive in my case, but I really am interested in this particular topic, and I want to explain why. The truth is that I've come to the conclusion that the most serious single reason for our less than lustrous public schools relates to the poor decisions that we have made in this country based on ignorance about educational assessment. I truly think this is the case. I mean, if I were in some kind of television show and I were asked what is the one big bopper reason that we've gone awry with respect to public education, my answer would be that we've made some very serious mistakes with regard to the decisions, the policies we've implemented because of misunderstandings regarding educational testing. Just yesterday, getting ready for this session today, I was kind of looking back at the Coleman report. And most of you are far too young to remember the Coleman report, but that was a report that came out in 1966 with James Coleman of the University of Chicago. And summarizing it quickly, what it says was that it didn't seem to make a lot of difference in how we spent money on schools, what made a difference in their performance, was their socioeconomic background. Well, it turns out that conclusion influenced national policymakers in a big way not to put as many resources into public education. Why on earth, if it didn't make any difference what we spent on public schools, should we spend much on public schools? And yet, in point of fact, Coleman's research was based on tests that were specifically designed to be linked to socioeconomic status. So tests designed to measure achievement, heavily influenced by socioeconomic status, showed us that socioeconomic status was a factor. What a stunning surprise. So those kinds of mistakes are the reason that I get really, not thrilled, but excited at least, about instructional sensitivity, and I'm glad we're talking about that today. And I should point out that earlier this morning I was assured by the people who organized this session that all of the participants in the webinar were of average or better personal appearance, personal attractiveness. I was assured in writing that there are no ugly participants in today's webinar, and I'm really pleased to be talking to such a good-looking group. Let me move to the next screen. And I'm pressing a little button, and that nothing is happening, guys. Why won't my little... there we are. Here are two outcomes of today's webinar that I hope will transpire. As you'll see, there's a cognitive one and an affective one. Let me look at the cognitive one with you. I hope that you will understand instructional sensitivity so well that if you want to do so, you can describe the nature of this thing called instructional sensitivity to others. You can defend its importance in evaluating teachers, and you can explain how to increase a test instructional sensitivity. Those are three things that I really want to have happen. What is it? Why is it important? And how do you make it better? And affectively, I would like you, in fact, to be disposed to do all three of those things. I think they're important. I think they can make a difference in the way we evaluate teachers. And I think if you truly understand the nature of instructional sensitivity and why it's so darned important when we're appraising teachers, that you'll be inclined to do so. At least that's my hope. I'll try to persuade you that that's what you ought to be about. I'm pressing the button now, and again, nothing has happened. I guess I'll press it again. There it goes. Along the way, we're going to stop occasionally. A question will be posed, and you'll be asked to give a few moments of silent thought to an issue associated with the webinar's content. You'll be asked to do so as part of a ploy to get you to actively contemplate issues associated with instructional sensitivity, and I'll refer to these as ponder pauses. The truth is, I want you to think about this stuff, and I understand that many of you are watching this webinar in isolation, and I've asked you to contemplate these issues silently. If you are uncomfortable by silence, you can whistle or hum or do anything of that sort. But I do want you to think carefully about some of these ponder opportunities, and one of them is coming up right now with Elizabeth in control.
Thanks, Jim. So before we get started in the heavy content of today's webinar, we'd like to hear from the audience about what you might already know about instructional sensitivity. So we realize that there may be plenty of folks in the audience who don't know, but take a stab at it and give us your best guess if you don't, and it will help to determine how to plan out the rest of the webinar. So you'll see a poll box come up, and you'll be able to answer using a typewritten response. What do you already know about instructional sensitivity? And Jim, while folks are typing, I'll direct your attention to the parking lot because we have 2 questions there already. And we may want to hold those until you've gotten a little further in because you might touch on some of the response. But Jim, Capilupo is asking about a situation in Pennsylvania with their growth model, and in quotes, hit the bar model, where they need both of these programs to be successful. And what's your opinion on that? So,
well, let me just tackle that one if I can, Elizabeth. The use of a growth model is criticized by many people, and myself included, although I'm not a sharp enough statistician to give you the particulars. But the truth is, if you start off with a test, which is by its very nature insensitive to detecting instructional impact, you can massage that puppy with statistics until it quivers and dies, but it's not going to make it any better. If you start out with the wrong test, the notion of using some kind of a growth model doesn't save the day at all. The essence is in the scores, and if those are the wrong scores, no amount of statistical machination will save that.
That's great, Jim, and helpful, and hopefully helpful to Jim Capilupo in Pennsylvania. I don't know if you want to take a look at the second question before we refer back to the responses we're getting. Carol's asking about do all states have the house certifications for special ed teachers? If so, are they evaluated the same way as other core curricular teachers?
I will now reveal my pervasive ignorance about many things, and I have no idea about the house certifications. Or I know that the notion of collecting evidence for quality regarding particular kinds of teachers ought to differ dramatically, and frankly, I've not seen any really good thinking on how one gauges the instructional skill of youngsters or teachers who work with distinctive youngsters. I just don't know enough about that. I'm sorry, Carol.
All right, so moving back into the poll box in the center, let's take a look at some of the responses. We've gotten quite a few. A few folks joining because they want to learn. That's great. You're going to learn a lot today. Folks equating it to what's taught in the classroom, equating it with progress monitoring, measuring the learning that's happening in classroom, measuring the breadth and depth of the curriculum. And you can feel free to jump in, Jim, with thoughts, but I know you're going to be sharing all of the correct answers as we go.
Well, it's clear that, Elizabeth, that people have different notions about this. There's no reason that anyone in the audience should feel particularly conversant with this. It hasn't been studied very much, hasn't been proclaimed very widely, so don't be at all dismayed if you don't already know this stuff. But the truth is, it's a fairly simple construct, and very shortly you will understand what its essence is, and then you'll decide whether or not it's important.
Okay, so with that, I think we'll move along. Jim, just to refresh your memory, down in the bottom of the left-hand corner of where the slides are, you have those two arrows, and you can click on those arrows to advance your slides. So I'm going to do it right now.
Yeah, if you will, please. This is very good. You've shown your ability to deal with the less able, and when it comes to operating this stuff, I've been pressing the keys on my laptop, and I've been developing muscles, but not much effect. So it's down there that, that's very helpful. Okay, instructional sensitivity. Let's start with the definition. I'm clicking on one now and hope something good will happen. Oh, come on. I just clicked on it. Aha.
There you go.
Thank you. Here's the definition of instructional sensitivity that I use, and I want all of you to become really sufficiently conversant with this that you can explain it to someone else. Now, let's go through it very slowly. Now, instructional sensitivity is simply the degree to which students' performances on a test, and its test performances, accurately reflect the quality of instruction specifically provided to promote students' mastery of what is being tested. Just look at that for a second and think about it. All that this definition is instructional sensitivity gives us an idea of the extent to which students' test performances accurately indicate how good instruction was that was designed specifically to promote students' achievement of whatever is being assessed. Putting it in other words, think of it this way. An instructionally sensitive test is one that can distinguish between well-taught and badly taught kids. That's all there is to it. An instructionally sensitive test can do that. An instructionally insensitive test cannot. Now, if you look at the definition just for a moment, I'm going to ask you to do something, which is to close your eyes and think if you had to explain that definition to someone else. Can you mentally do that in your head with your eyes closed? Now, look at it for a second. Instructional sensitivity is the degree to which students' performances on a test accurately reflect the quality of instruction specifically provided to promote students' mastery of what is being assessed. That's the definition of instructional sensitivity. Look at it for a second. Now close your eyes and just mentally think, I would explain it this way if I were explaining it to someone. Those of you who peaked, you lose. I want to return to that definition occasionally, but this is what we're talking about today. This is instructional sensitivity. And the simplest analogous language, it's just the extent to which a test can tell the difference between well-taught and badly taught kids. And that's a lot tougher than you think. It doesn't mean that if you get a test score, it automatically tells you the difference between a well-taught and a badly taught child. And that's where we're going with this. Now, I've pressed the little machine, and again, we're supposed to be, there it is. Why this topic? I want to take just a few moments, if I can, folks. I live in Oregon now, by the way. I taught at UCLA for a lot of years, but I live in Oregon now, and not surprised it's raining. And I've been here for 5 or 6 years. And what I want to do is I want to convince you that I'm not dealing with this topic just because I'm a measurement guy and I want to strum my measurement mandolin. It's not that way at all. And just allow me to trace very quickly a career that ends up with this webinar today. First off, it says a preoccupation with instruction. I was a philosophy major as an undergraduate, didn't know what I wanted to do. The possibility of teaching appealed to me, so I took a teacher education program at a small university in Oregon and ended up being a teacher. My teacher education program was god-awful. It was terrible. And I became convinced, after teaching in high school for a while, that what I wanted to do was to move into the field of teacher education. I wanted to do a better job, given the rather inept quality of what I'd received. I knew this was not a field in which competence was the prevalent mode of behavior, and I just wanted to do better. So I spent my entire graduate program, working on a doctorate at Indiana University, focused exclusively on instruction. I did not take a single course in testing. Couldn't have cared less about testing. And then I got out, and I taught in a couple little colleges, ended up at UCLA in 1962, specifically designed there to prepare prospective teachers, elementary and secondary teachers. And that's all I cared about, instruction. And somewhere along in the late 60s, I became interested in criterion reference measurement because it seemed to me that people were attending more to the consequences of instruction. And so Robert Glaser of the University of Pittsburgh introduced the concept of criterion reference measurement in 1963, and I'd just gone to UCLA the year before, and so I was kind of intrigued with what he was saying about it. He was very much involved in programmed instruction and teaching machines, and you folks probably haven't even heard about those for many years, but they literally, it was thought that people could indeed create machines that could help teach kids. And so I became interested in criterion reference testing, and then all of a sudden these tests that we've been talking about using became genuine game changers when they became high-stakes tests. And at first it was reliance on passing a high school diploma in order to get that high school diploma. And it truly made a tremendous difference. And the reason for that was people who did not pass those tests did not graduate, and you can be assured that what happened in our schools was that people taught, indeed, what was on the test. So this became terribly influential. And what I realized was that if you control the tests that influence the instruction, you controlled instruction. And literally overnight, when that realization hit me, I moved in the field of assessment. And then we started using tests increasingly to evaluate schools. We use these tests less so to evaluate teachers in those days, but we certainly evaluated schools and school districts, and people were not getting better at it. Everyone was losing. No one was making gains, and this troubled me. And so in 2001, we established a national commission with some really hotshot people on it, like David Berliner and Eva Baker and Jim Pellegrino, and these folks met out in Los Angeles, and we concluded that it was possible to create tests that were suitable for accountability purposes, and yet could be could be supportive of instruction. We advocated something called instructionally supportive assessments, and this was in 2001, prior to the election that brought us President Bush, George W. Bush, as the president. Up until that time, both presidential candidates, Al Gore and Bush, had been talking about more accountability, more assessment, both of them. And it became quite clear that's what they wanted. They wanted more assessment-based accountability. Well, if you looked at what was happening in this country during that era, we were seeing that teachers were spending way too much time teaching only that which was tested. There was curricular reductionism going on. A lot of it, that was a bad thing. There was excessive test preparation. This is way back in 2000. And teachers were spending enormous amounts of time prepping kids for tests, accountability tests. And finally, there were some flat-out instances of teachers cheating. This is bad stuff going on. And so we recommended the use of instructionally supportive assessments. And the essence of that recommendation was pretty straightforward. We said, if you have a modest number of targets, not a plethora, but a modest number, 6, 7, 8, curricular aims in, let's say, reading or mathematics, you could have enough items to measure kids' attainment of each of those things, and as a consequence, you could find out how well kids were doing. Moreover, you could clarify the nature of what was to be assessed in such a way that teachers could effectively direct their instruction not toward test items, but toward the skills being measured by those tests. And this was, we thought, a very reasonable stance. And so we got our commission report around, and one state, Wyoming, accepted it and created a test, a state accountability test, consistent with the recommendations of our group. They had in 8 skills in reading. From K through 12, they had only 8 skills, and they measured them with enough items you could tell whether a kid had mastered each of the skills. And they were sufficiently clear, you could teach toward them. And so our group that was advising the state of Wyoming in what they were doing, we were all jazzed about this, and then it just came hitting us right in the head. What if the tests that were being used did not show how effective this instruction was? What if the tests that were being developed for Wyoming, even though Wyoming was getting some clues as to how it could design good instruction, what if those instructionally supportive tests did not prove to be better, did not prove to improve the caliber of instruction? And therein we realized we'd missed it. What we should have been talking about is instructionally supportive tests that were also instructionally sensitive. And therein we began pushing the notion of instructional sensitivity and figuring out how to do it. Because frankly, folks, the people in the testing companies that were working with Wyoming, or indeed any other state, they didn't have the foggiest notion of how to create tests that were indeed instructionally sensitive. And so that's why we began pushing it, and today perhaps is an example of what I've been trying to do for the last 10 or so years, which is really get people to pay attention to this particular problem, because if you don't, you're going to have tests that are not appropriate for their purpose. And I'm clicking on the button now, but nothing is happening again, guys. Thank you. Okay. There's a story I want you to learn, and I want you to learn this stuff well enough so you realize why today's current educational assessment scene in the U.S. is in fact attributable to something that happened 100 years ago. And it'll be a short story, but it's a story that really is worth your understanding. If people could only understand where today's tests came from and why they are designed in that fashion, then they could realize why many of these tests that we are using to evaluate the caliber of schooling are altogether inappropriate for that purpose. Okay, we go back to 100 years, which is about the time that we were embroiled in World War I, not World War II. But in World War I, we needed to have some kind of a test that would help people in the Army identify prospective officer candidates. That is, young men who would go in, be lieutenants, and lead the troops. And they didn't know how to do that. And so leaders of the Army came to the American Psychological Association. A man named Robert Yerkes was the president. And they said, can you help us identify likely candidates for officer training programs? And Yerkes appointed a committee of, it was in fact 8, by the way, my machine, Elizabeth, my screen is no longer functional. I hope this is not everyone else's screen, but mine isn't working at all. So Yerkes appointed this committee. They worked in 7 days and 7 nights, and then they developed the Army Alpha. And when they did that, this test was administered. The Alpha was a group administrable IQ test, and it was administered to 1,750,000 men during World War I. And it worked remarkably well, because what it did was present mental problems, some verbal, and some quantitative to candidates. And based on their performance on those tests, they scored at the 98th percentile, the 93rd percentile. The function of the test, which was in essence a group administrable IQ test, was to discriminate among test takers so that you could compare them. The tests were designed to yield comparative interpretations of test takers' performance. And based on this, decisions were made as to where these Army recruits went. The really more able ones were sent to officer training programs, 85th, 90th percentile and above officer training programs. The people who scored in the middle percentiles were sent to the trenches to fight the war. The people who scored very low were encouraged to go into public relations or some place where they could actually be successful. Well, the focus of those tests was on comparative score interpretations, absolutely comparative score interpretations. And as a consequence, it became the way we began to think about our testing in this country. But it was right after World War I is over, as early as the early 20s, when the aptitude approach to testing that had been prevalent in the case of the Army Alpha was adopted for achievement tests. The Stanford Achievement Test, now in their 11th or 12th revision, the very first edition of the Stanford came out in 1923, just after World War I, and the approach to the achievement test was precisely the same as the Army Alpha approach. That is, spread out the examinees such that you can compare them, and comparative score interpretations is what we are searching for. Now, that worked very well. No question about it, in World War I, highly successful. And because it was so successful, we began to develop an educational assessment methodology that is absolutely the same as the one employed for the Army Alpha. And that's why you see that educational measurement experts still are committed to comparative interpretations for a full century. Now the question is whether those tests are suitable for teacher evaluation. But what I want you to understand is that today's conceptualization of educational testing is rooted in the alpha, is rooted in Vineland Training School in Vineland, New Jersey, where the 8 guys who, and they were 8 white guys who set up the Army Alpha, that test that they created, that test is the one that influences our thinking about educational assessment, because we've had generations of people who are in fact committed to the notion that educational tests must produce comparative score interpretations. And I can't operate my screen anymore, Elizabeth, because I can't see it, but if you can push ahead for a slide that says a quest for score spread, I hope that's up on the screen now, because that's all
It is.
Is it up there?
Yeah, we're working behind the scenes to get you back where you need to be. I don't know what's happening, but I'll continue advance. You just let me know when you're ready, and I'll...
Okay, well, right now we should have a quest for score spread. And what it says in that particular screen, I have a hard copy, thank God. In order for educational tests to provide scores permitting accurate comparisons to be made among test takers, it is necessary to include many items that do a good job in creating substantial total score variance, that is total test score variability. That is lots of score spread. The more score spread a test yields, the greater the potential for subtle contrast among test takers' performances. Now, if you just think about it, folks, you realize when we have kids sit down for an achievement test, you can't test them for much longer than 40, 50 minutes, an hour at the outside. And during that time, you have to have enough responses from them such that when you try to compare their scores on a percentile basis, you really can spread them out. If too many of the kids scored most of the items correctly or missed most of the items, you couldn't spread them out. So score spread is imperative. I mean, it's like a deity, if you will, to the creators of standardized achievement tests. Now, I want to show you what these creators of standardized achievement tests do as a necessity to create score spread. So could you, Elizabeth, flip to the next one, which says a 6th grade science item? This is, I'm assuming it'll be there unless you tell me otherwise, this item is taken from, I think it was about 3 years ago, an actual standardized test used in this country. What it does is present to 6th graders the following question. A plant's fruit always contains seeds. Which of the items below is not a fruit? And if you look down there, you'll find that the answer is celery. Okay. We'd like kids to know that, technically celery is not a fruit. But the point is, the kid who comes from a background where the child's parents can afford to buy fresh fruit, fresh celery, pumpkins at Halloween time, this kid has a subtle edge over a kid whose parents are getting by on food stamps. The kid who is affluent has a subtle edge over a kid who is not affluent, because there will be more links to the affluence. What you have in essence is a normal distribution of socioeconomic status. It doesn't change all that often. And to the extent that you can have items that are linked to SES, then you're going to have the normal distribution of performance on a test item that is so imperative for producing score spread. And that happens a lot. It's not as though the creators of standardized achievement tests set out to penalize the less affluent. But as a matter of test development fact, it is the case that if you're looking for items that do the spread out job, then any items linked to SES will be wonderful for that purpose. If you could turn to the next item, please. Here we have a 4th grade mathematics item, again taken from an actual standardized test. Which of the letters below, when folded in half, will have 2 parts that match exactly? Well, if you look at those items, the correct answer, the only one, is B. The fact is, however, that although it's teachable, mental letter folding, although it could be improved. It just doesn't happen in schools. What happens is the reason that kids get this right is some youngsters are born with more spatial visualization capability than are others. And kids are born from the get-go with different aptitudes. I have 4 children. It was my Catholic period. And I have 3 boys and 1 girl. And the girl is really good at verbal stuff, terrible at quantitative stuff. The 3 guys are just the opposite. They're far better quantitatively than verbally. Children are born with dissimilar abilities. And that intellectual aptitude is such that if you can link your items to the aptitude with which youngsters were born, you're more likely to get that normal score spread, and you're more likely to get the kind of contrast that's so crucial. And so if the next screen can come up, what you end up with is you end up with a clear contrast in the purpose of educational testing. You can first have a comparative focus. That is, tests that are created to provide comparative interpretations among test takers. I have no problem with those kinds of tests. There's a reason for these kinds of assessments, and this is particularly true when you have fixed quota situations, where indeed you have the necessity to make decisions about a small number of kids. Fewer openings, more applicants, and you have to make those decisions. You have to pick the best, the worst. There is a role for comparative tests. I have no problem with any test that we're using today if used for that purpose. But when you flip them over to make them supposedly evaluatively oriented, then of course there is a mistake. Here we have an instructional focus next. These are tests that are created intended to have a direct impact on instruction itself. We don't have a lot of these, folks. And we don't have a lot of them because not too many people realize that you could create tests for just this purpose. But here are 3 ways you could have tests that would make for better instruction and better kid learning. The first is by supplying lucid instructional targets. I never think you should start an instructional sequence planning for it unless you have a clear notion of how the sequence is going to be assessed. When the Common Core state standards came down and we saw all those lofty and lovely targets, I said, wait, guys, wait until you get the assessments, because then you will know what they really mean. When you operationalize a sometimes vague and broad curricular aim with an actual test, then you'll know the kind of thing you're trying to get your youngsters to master, and this is really important. The second way is by providing instructionally diagnostic results, tests that permit you to know which sub-skills or which bodies of knowledge kids have not achieved that they must achieve in order to reach master of the ultimate goal. And this you can do, but only if you design the test in a particular fashion. And the third way that tests can supply an instructional purpose is by accurately measuring instructional quality, and that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about whether or not a test is instructionally sensitive, that is, can distinguish between well-taught and badly taught kids. And now, Elizabeth, if you will take over and take the next slide, I'm hoping you found it.
Yes, Jim, I'm happy to do so. And since you lost your screen, I want to suggest a few things. One is since we still have you on sound, I don't want to lose that. If you want to click back on the link and re-enter the room while folks are answering this question, we can see if we can get you reconnected.
I'll try.
And otherwise, I'm happy to read to you what's on the screen because there are a few questions.
Okay.
So I'll give you a moment to try to reconnect. And during that time, I'll have folks on the line take a look at the question on the screen. Since the days of the Army Alpha that Jim talked about just a short time ago, America's educational testing industry is focused almost exclusively on the creation of comparatively oriented tests rather than instructionally focused tests. And now we're curious to find out why you all think this is so. You'll see a poll come up, and you can take a few moments to think about that. And Jim, I don't know if you're connected again yet, but folks are saying it's just the way we've always done it. A couple of folks with that response to determine growth for accountability purposes. Education leaders found value in naming top performers because it was easier, cheaper, and more cost-effective. We wanted to make a similar decision to the Army Alpha. And lots of responses are coming in. People wanted to know how they compare with others because the Army test discriminated so well and enabled investment in a small number of top performers. Because our education system still suffers from competition-based practices rather than mastery-based practices. Feel free to jump on in and give your thoughts on any of these responses that you're hearing.
I was just kind of hoping my little stuff would come back on. I see something that resembles a webinar screen, but clicking on join.
Look over to the, maybe on your bar at the bottom, sometimes the second window opens up all the way to the far right.
I think yep, I'm back there. Well, it's obvious that I guess I have the screen back again. Thank you.
Wonderful.
It's fairly obvious, Elizabeth, that people have some different intuitions about this, and I guess I wanted to give you my own take on it. It so bothers me at a visceral level that we in the education profession have allowed ourselves to be evaluated as to our competence using tests for which there is no evidence that they are suitable for that purpose. None. It defies my comprehension. And I really have spent a number of years worrying why that is the case. And, you know, I have one additional possibility to toss into the mix that you folks have come up with, and that is peer approval. That may seem kind of strange, but I believe that, you know, I now run more frequently with Measurement Crowd. I wash my hands frequently when I interact with them, and but they're smart. They're smart folks. And as a consequence of this, I can assure you, I wonder why is it that they are not attending to this concern. And the truth is, I think in some instances, they want to model their work in a manner that's consonant with what their peers expect. I think they're literally creating traditional psychometric indicators, traditional ways of verifying reliability, validity, and the rest, because that's the way it has been done. You know, you think about the people. I know there are a number of researchers on the webinar today. Many researchers who are trained in classical psychometrics were trained in Army Alpha kind of testing. That's the way they did it. And as a consequence, they want to make sure they don't do things that would not be approved by their colleagues. Remember I mentioned earlier on my background is from instruction. I came to testing because I realized it was a way to influence instruction. I think it's the most cost-effective, potent way to influence instruction that there is. And so in moving in this direction, I really had to worry hard about what I wanted tests to do. I don't want tests to do just the comparative stuff. I want tests to improve learning. I don't believe there are many folks in our field, in this country, who conceive of tests dominantly, even exclusively, as vehicles to make kids learn better. And I think if you did that, you would have a big impact on instruction, big impact on learning, but I don't think you would be greeted with approval by your colleagues. And that's my take on it, too.
Jim, before we move on from this question, and thanks everybody for your thoughtful responses. We have a few things in the parking lot, and I know you're just catching back up to getting on the screen. And
why don't you read them to me or summarize them, if you will?
Sure thing. The one I want to touch on right now, because it relates to just kind of a clarification maybe. Susan is asking, she said I thought I read that tests should be insensitive to instruction when used for accountability purposes. She said, I might have imagined it.
No, it's just the opposite. If a test is insensitive to instruction, it's not able to distinguish between well-taught and badly taught children. Ergo, it should not be used for accountability. Should not be used. When a test is insensitive to instruction, it does not tell whether a teacher has taught well or badly, therefore should not be used to evaluate teachers. And it defies me, Susan, that our teachers' organizations in this country, either state, regional, or national, have not come out vigorously to oppose the misuse of instructionally insensitive tests to evaluate their brethren. It's just the wrong thing to do.
All right, another question from Jim. He's asking, references back of a while back when you were talking about what different states are doing. He says, does any state have a system that is, let's say, closer to right? So are there maybe any examples
No,
you would want to?
The only thing, and by the way, Elizabeth, I'm getting some little thing says the person dialed chose not to join the conference. I keep pressing join and getting thrown off. This could make me want to go back to chalkboards. But I don't think there is any state Department of Education. There has been a deliberate effort to assure that the tests are sensitive to instruction before using them to evaluate instruction. Putting it differently, any test that is used evaluatively in this country should be accompanied by evidence that it is suitable for that purpose. And I know of no state that has devoted energy, meaningful energy, to verifying whether its tests used for evaluative purposes are instructionally sensitive. And I see a question from Jim. That's his second question. Therefore, I feel obliged to answer. It says, are the MAPS from NWEA a good test to use? The MAPS tests are accompanied by no evidence whatsoever regarding their instructional sensitivity. And from that comment, you can infer my response.
And several more questions, folks asking about specific tests, and I don't know that we want to necessarily go into each one. But of course, many states moving to PARCC and smarter balance assessments. And the question, in your opinion, are those tests being designed with more attention to the instructional sensitivity?
Those are really good questions, folks, and applause for the good questions. But the reality is, you can tell whether a test is in fact instructionally sensitive is whether it is accompanied by evidence attesting to the instructional sensitivity. And I'll describe to you today how you go about getting that kind of information. But with respect to the PARCC test and the Smarter Balance test, distressingly, there is no evidence that those tests are instructionally sensitive, nor was there evidence of any attempt during their creation to increase their instructional sensitivity.
And we'll continue to take the questions in the parking lot and respond to those as we have some breaks here, but I'm going to let you move ahead, Jim. I think you can see the screen now, and we'll move into the next section on instructional sensitivity and teacher evaluation.
Okay, I will. And I assume that people can see that cute little picture of me up in the upper left-hand corner. Is that right, Elizabeth?
I sure can.
Okay,
I don't know how.
I just want to call people's attention to the fact that this is my espionage writer ensemble. I think this makes me look a hell of a lot more like a writer of espionage novels than some guy who jabbers about educational tests. But I just wanted you to know that. Okay, thank you for moving the screen ahead. And here's the thing that we have to start paying attention to now. We have two initiatives of the federal government, not laws passed by Congress, but in much the same way that President Obama is now threatening to use some kind of executive order to accomplish certain things. There were two programs in recent years that really caused a considerable attention and movement on the part of people in their thinking and their talking about teacher evaluation. This whole series of webinars that Mid-Atlantic Regional Ed Lab is producing are focused on teacher effectiveness, teacher evaluation. And what you have to realize is we would not have had these webinars, this discussion, the concern about teacher evaluation if it hadn't been for those two programs on the screen. Now, the 2009 Race to the Top program was designed to accomplish some objectives of the Department of Education, and there was money available, and so some very, very green carrots were laid out there to cash-starved states, saying if you will cleave to certain features of what we want you to do, including refurbished and improved teacher evaluation program, you can get some big bucks. And some of the states were so desperate because they were so short on dollars that they complied with zeal. And among the zealous compliers were those that actually enacted state laws in almost direct acquiescence to whatever the feds wanted. And I'll talk about what those were in a second. But fundamentally, that was do what we want and you'll get the dollars program. The second was the 2011 ESEA Flexibility Program, and that was a program designed to give waivers to states so they would not have to comply with the terribly unrealistic end of the NCLB sequence where almost every state in a school would be regarded as failing and thereby, of course, rendering the whole thing silly. But fundamentally, this was a way for states to have more flexibility in how they determined whether a school was doing satisfactorily in promoting adequate yearly progress. And so as a consequence, that waiver program held out the possibility of avoiding penalties. And both of those were predicated on the need for a refurbished and improved teacher appraisal program. Next slide, please. Now, here I give you a quotation from myself. I have found over a long career that self-citation is one of the most effective ploys of an academic, and here we see an example. I wrote this in 1971. I think down at the bottom it says, January 71. This is the initial sentence of an article followed by many equally enchanting sentences. No question about it. You pick up that article and you just have to read it in text several times before you put it down. What I'm trying to suggest here is that I've been mucking around with teacher evaluation for a lot of years. It's kind of weird, but when I went to Indiana U as a research assistant, my very first assignment at Indiana U, as part of my job to get tuition money and so on, was to do an analysis of review of teacher effectiveness research in the first half of the century, and that was the last century. The first half of the century, from 1900 to 1954, a review had been done by two guys named Morse and Wilder of Lackland Air Force Base. And this was a marvelous analysis of everything that had been done up to that point. And I guess what I'm trying to suggest is from literally, that was in 56. From that point forward, I've spent much of my career dipping in and out of the teacher of effectiveness wars. Usually when struggling with one of those problems, the problem has ended up on top. rather than I. And I'll tell you, I've made all the mistakes there are to make. I've used well, like this particular one, performance test of teaching proficiency. I developed a test where a teacher would be given a set of precise objectives, instructional objectives, very clear, examples of test items to measure those, and given a period of time during which they had to teach students how to accomplish those objectives. And at the end of the instruction, a test would be administered whose hadn't been seen by the teacher before, but could be readily inferred by the nature of the objectives and the sample items that have been given. And we were trying to test the ability of the teacher to promote students' accomplishment of pre-specified instructional objectives. I spent 9 years in that particular arena. Took it down to the San Diego City schools in a major effort to verify that it was effective in distinguishing between effective and ineffective teachers. And what we did is we had groups of experienced teachers, judged superior by their principals, compared their performance to people off the street who had subject matter conversants but who had never taught. And I did that in 4 different fields. The prediction was, is the experienced teachers, judged superior by their principals, would be better able than people off the street to promote kids' mastery of the pre-specified instructional objectives. Gang, to my regret, it fell flat on its fanny. It didn't work. And in retrospect, I made a mistake in my analysis. The mistake was in assuming that teachers have been taught how to promote students' mastery of pre-specified objectives. A good teacher ought to be able to do that, right? Well, they hadn't been taught how to, and it just fell on its face. So I've made all the mistakes there are. And so when, in fact, these two federal initiatives came out, I was really intrigued by them. And if you'd move on to the next screen, please. I was really intrigued by them. And here were the initiatives, the emphases of the 2 initiatives. Now, first, there's got to be some lip service given to instructional improvement, and there was some, but a state had to set up a system where not only was there attention to instructional improvement, but you had to have 3 performance levels, and that was easy to do. Multiple evidence sources had to be used, and student growth had to be a significant factor. These evaluations had to be performed regularly. They had to supply some kind of useful feedback, and they were contributory to personnel decisions. Now advance the slide, if you will, please. And
Jim, I'm going to jump in for a second before I advance because we do have a question in the parking lot. Carol asked a little while ago, but it relates to something on this slide.
Okay.
She's asking, what does the presenter, what do you, Jim, think of the value-added measures? She says these are not based on pre- and post-test, at least not anywhere I know.
Value-added measures have their limitations. If you think about the methodology employed in Tennessee and elsewhere, value-added methodology has all sorts of difficulty when it comes to evaluating the performance of a particular teacher in a particular setting. That's absolutely the case. But if the value-added measure starts off with instructionally insensitive tests, tests for which there is no evidence that they're capable of gauging whether a kid has been taught badly or well, can you see that it just makes no sense at all? So value-added methodology is a separate question from the tests being used. But if the tests being used are not appropriate for detecting instructional quality, then how on earth can any kind of statistical methodology win the day? Now can I have my advanced slide? Okay.
You sure can. There you go.
All right, I've earned it. I know that. What I wanted you to focus on were these 2 underscored elements. These are the real game changers. The bottom one is contributory to personnel decisions. Now look, folks, we have had a long history in this country of formatively oriented teacher evaluation. Teacher evaluations where the push was to improve the caliber of the teaching. to improve the quality of kid learning. And that's been wonderful. That's fine. No problem with that. But let me assure you, what the feds had in mind when they set up these 6 criteria, one of which had huge teeth, is that they wanted it to be more summatively oriented. They wanted ineffective teachers to be excised, to be offered improvement opportunities, but if they couldn't improve, to be tossed into another field. They wanted to save children from being taught by ineffectual teachers, and that's understandable. And so that particular thing didn't bother me. But what I found particularly interesting is the third requirement. Now, multiple evidence sources were to be used. Okay, multiple evidence sources like student growth, that's one. You could have teacher observation, that's another. You could have student evaluations. You could have a variety of different kinds of evidence that could be employed. But student growth had to be a significant factor. They didn't define exactly what significance was, but you had some state legislatures literally enacting laws that said that student growth, that is, kid performance on tests, would count at least 50% on the evaluation of a teacher. I think Arizona had at least 33%. Different states. And why were they doing this? Why were they complying so completely with federal preferences regarding the evaluation of teachers? They were doing it for the money. They were doing it for the waiver. They would do darn near anything they could to get those bucks, to get those waivers. And so they were saying they would do this and do this well. And this is why I decided to write that book that Elizabeth mentioned earlier, Evaluating American Teachers, and it came out last year, because I wanted to say, hey guys, I made a lot of mistakes in my life, learn from them. What's kind of stunning to me is our failure to realize how little attention has been paid to summative teacher evaluation in this nation. If you assume that state departments of education have a lot of moxie regarding how to play that game, you are mistaken. We don't know how to do this. People haven't written a whale of a lot about teacher evaluation, and because my career had dipped in and out of it all this time, I paid some attention to it. But I guess what I wanted to bring to your attention is that this is an arena in which relatively few people know how to play the game, and that's truly important. And I want to flip to you, Elizabeth, now, if you'll take the next slide. You there, Elizabeth?
Oh, here I am. Sorry, I was still muted. We're going to take a minute to pause and ponder once again, reflecting a little bit on what Jim just shared about the 2009 and 2011 initiatives of ESEA flexibility and the race to the top. So what we'd like you all to think about is, with these two initiatives calling for more evidence of student growth as a significant factor in appraising teachers, why do you think this is so? And moreover, why do you think the federal officials have placed so much emphasis on assessed evidence of students' learning?
Yeah, and I just want to back up what Elizabeth is saying. I really want you to think, why is it they push so heavily on evidence of kids' test scores as a prominent factor in judging teachers?
So we'll put another poll up, and you can start to respond to that question. And Jim, while folks are responding to that, we have some questions that we received in our registration that you and I discussed before starting today's webinar. So I think we can start trying to tackle some of those so we make sure we address all of folks' questions. One is related to local school districts and what can their role be in developing locally developed assessments that are instructionally sensitive?
Well, actually, there are fewer folks in the webinar today from local school jurisdictions than I had anticipated, and I figured that there'd be more, and as a consequence, they'd be worried about doing that. But the answer is, if you're really trying to improve the instructional sensitivity of locally developed tests, then you need to use one of the two methodologies that I'll be describing in the remainder of the webinar. And one of those is judgmental, and one of them is empirical. And because the empirical one for a school district of any size, any reasonable size, except a very large one, empirical approaches just can't be done. So it's judgmental. And I guess if you'd hold on to that question and the answer for a bit, when we get around to judgmental ways of detecting instructionally insensitive items, then I think you'll see how that could be done at the local level. So the answer is do it judgmentally and follow some of the suggestions that I'll be offering.
Great. So we'll switch gears back to the responses here on the question on the screen, and we're getting some responses. I think you can see those, right?
Right, I can.
Sure.
Well, you know, do you think there was something insidious about the feds requiring this? Elizabeth, is it okay to ask you to ever respond to these kinds of things, or are you just verboten because you are a process person now?
I can discuss some of this, sure.
Okay. Now, I know you mentioned that you enjoy your time in the schools and you like being back in the schools so much. Don't you think that when the federal official says you've got to use student scores as a, quote, significant factor, end quote, in judging a teacher, weren't they signaling incredulity regarding what people out in the field were doing? Don't you think they were saying, we don't trust you?
I think that that's the perception, is that there is a general mistrust of teachers, and more than just that, it's the notion that we want there to be some consistency across schools, districts, states in terms of what students are learning. So in my opinion, that's a piece of it.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I really do, and it's understandable. I mean, it's understandable. If you look at our track record in the field of education at dismissing teachers on the grounds of incompetence, almost no one is identified as being incompetent. It's like a presumption of everyone wins. That's just crazy. I've told you I've been working with teacher evaluation all of my career, and at one time I really used to keep track of what states use as factors to terminate a teacher, and there were always two. One was incompetence. That was never defined usually, but you kind of understood what it meant. And the other was immorality. So incompetence or immorality. But in one Western state, when I was doing all this work, in one Western state, the two conditions for dismissal were incompetence and gross immorality. Now, apparently, it was not just your average run-of-the-mill immorality. It had to be the Rocco Sacco immorality. And so, you know, if you look back at our tradition of how many teachers we have excised on the basis of incompetence, there's so few that I wouldn't trust us either. Well, why should you? Because we seem to have systems that are focused more on caring for the continued job security of the grown-ups than for promoting what's good for the children. And that's offensive to me, and it's offensive to, I think, the people who are the architects of these regulations in Washington.
So one of the other things that's coming across here in the responses and the participants' thoughts about this is sort of twofold, but the public perception of whether teachers are doing what they need to and the whole accountability focus, as well as the notion that there are no other measures that can do what tests do. So our observations and our more perceptive ways of looking at teaching are not giving us the same information that tests might give us.
And that's a reasonable speculation. The fact is, and I try to talk about this in that 2013 book on teacher evaluation. Teacher evaluation is like any other kind of personnel evaluation. You identify what you consider to be the important factors on which you will appraise a teacher. You identify the evidence that you will use to reach a judgment regarding the way the teacher stacks up on those factors. And you collect the evidence and you make a judgment. Now, what's different about our teaching field is that teachers function in a particular school with particular kids and a particular set of parents and a particular principal and all sorts of expectations regarding those particulars, which means that even though you use different kinds of evidence, some of which might be student performance evidence, some of which might be observational evidence, some of which might be student appraisals. I mean, self-evaluation, or rather evaluations of the teachers by kids. All of those kinds of evidence, depending on their quality in that particular setting, have to be judged. So you have to use human judgment to reach a decision, because you're reaching a decision about Molly Jones, who teaches the 4th grade. This is not abstract. That's Molly Jones. And Molly Jones happens to be teaching kids who for the previous 2 years were taught by a very inept 2nd grade or 3rd grade teacher. And so these kids are coming to Molly, and they're far less capable than they ought to be, because not of what Molly isn't doing, but what was done to them before. That's a particular situation, and the best we can use to judge the legitimacy of evaluation is to take human beings, look at all the factors, and then make the judgment. So I'd want to use human judgment of all the factors, but I'd certainly want to particularize it to Molly.
Jim, Susan's asking a question about student evaluations. I think maybe she's referring to student surveys of teachers and the fact that she's read that those have high validity. Interestingly, we have our next Ask an Expert topic on student surveys, so we'd encourage you, Susan, and others to come to that session. But Jim, can you speak to that now?
By the way, Elizabeth, that was a very clever tease there. I mean, that was as good as I've ever seen it done on network television. Okay, so
I'm good like that.
I noticed that the next one is dealing with that. Now, I think it was in the Gates study of teacher effectiveness that student evaluations were judged to be of value, and I think they are. I think they're tremendous value. But here's one you got to be really careful, gang. And the care has to be exercised in the kind of evaluations that are used and the way they're administered and so on. Look, students are not used to evaluating teachers, and some students will clearly make mistakes when they evaluate teachers. Some will be excessively lenient, buttering up the teacher because they don't think the teacher should view their class as anything other than a bunch of worshipers. Some kids will use this as an opportunity to get back at a vile teacher who gave them too much trouble during the year, and they'll give excessively negative evaluations. But on balance, as they average out, you get a pretty reasonable fix on the teacher. So you got to look very carefully at how the kids have been prepared to supply these evaluations. You have to look at the evaluation form itself, and then you, by golly, have to make sure that it is anonymous, that there's no way that the appraisal can be traced back to the kid who supplied it. And if kids really believe this, they will supply very useful evidence that can, if I were a part of a teacher evaluation team, that I would consider terribly salient in judging the caliber of the teacher. So the evidence, if well formulated, and I guess you're going to learn about it the next webinar along these lines, if it's done properly, it can be tremendously advantageous, and it ought to be used all the time.
Jim, I want to point out one other thing I don't want to overlook. There's a couple comments related to money and finances and the belief among some in this group and then a lot of folks in the public that testing is all about what it can generate for testing companies, for politicians, for those who can benefit from this testing industry. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's clear that testing these days is remarkably big business, and it can generate huge amounts of money. But I used to be in that field for about a dozen years. We created high-stakes tests. I have a company with 30, 35 employees down in Los Angeles, and we created tests for roughly 13, 14 states, high-stakes tests. And so I've been there and I've done that. And yeah, you can make some money out of it. Now, the question is, though, what kinds of tests will be produced? I'm not opposed to paying decent money to testing companies if they can produce the kinds of assessments we need to improve the quality of kid learning. I don't mind paying good money to competent people. That's fine. But what offends me is that we're paying huge amounts of money for the wrong kinds of tests. And that is, to me, a travesty. We're seeing a considerable backlash against testing these days. And understandably, I mean, it's taken a lot of kid time that could be better spent on instruction. Well, what's offensive to me is the tests that we are calling for are tests that frankly, don't do the job. So in a sense, I guess I learned when I was in that business that testing companies will do darn near anything that they are told to do because they'll make a profit off it. And so what I think we have to do is be smarter about the kinds of tests we demand that they produce, the evidence that we require them to show us, and so on. And if we did that, I think we'd get by with a lot less testing because, frankly, I want testing to improve what children learn. I don't want testing just to be used to come up with wrong-headed evaluations of teachers and schools. And that's what we're getting now, wrong-headed evaluations.
Well, as Jim Capilupo in our parking lot says, he wishes that you would work with some states and create a test that we can use and one that works. So maybe that's the charge for folks in the audience today, is to take this message back and start forcing the change. Because I don't know, Jim, if you're going to be going back into the testing industry.
Oh,
but
no. It's just like acne. You go through it once and you never want to go back again. It's not something I plan to do. And Elizabeth, the question is a good one. What could people participating in the webinar today do about this if their state is in fact either using a consortium-based test or using its own test for which there is no evidence of instructional sensitivity? If that is the case, then you ought to be screaming from the rooftops to do something better, not to allow this to go on. And the way you do that is to become more assessment knowledgeable yourself. Don't just defer to some assessment experts who said this. There was a guy from Oregon. No, don't do that. Instead, know at least enough about it to say, where's your evidence? Where's your evidence that this test, if used, can tell me if this teacher taught these kids well or badly? Where's the evidence? And if it isn't there, by God, don't you dare use that to evaluate schools or teachers. It's not appropriate. Now, you can't scream that stuff out unless you know enough about it to scream knowledgeably. Knowledgeable screams are better than irrelevant screams. So I guess what I would encourage all of you to do is to learn enough about this issue. And it's not that tough. It really is not that complicated to learn enough about this issue so you could do something about it. Get better tests in there. Better tests and fewer tests will give us the results we want.
And with that, we'll move right along into the next section on instructional sensitivity and the new standards.
Okay, and this kind of moves us forward to the moment where we have an opportunity to do something based on the timeliness of the release of these things. Now, I'm referring here to and in fact, the next screen would probably be helpful if you would, please. I'm referring specifically to the standards for educational and psychological testing. That's the book. They're referred to often as the standards or the joint standards because they were produced by 3 organizations. But the technical name is the Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing. They were just published in 2014, in July, just a few months ago. And it took about 5 years to get these ready. And they were produced on behalf of 3 major organizations. That is, all of them concerned with educational measurement. The American Educational Research Association, the American Psychological Association, and the National Council on Measurement in Education. Now, because the previous publication of this influential book occurred in 1999, the new standards are absolutely going to have an impact on educational testing in the U.S. And why do they have an impact? Well, you know, there are a lot of outfits that produce standards, and standards are just words, and the words don't make any difference. But these standards are used in litigation. I've appeared as an expert witness in a number of trials regarding the use or misuse of educational tests, and the joint standards always play a prominent role. Now you got some brand new ones, and those standards can be a stimulus for action. I'm doing a session back in North Carolina next year, and I was just sending emails to the person in charge of that session this morning and saying to her, well, you know, one of the things we could do is we could empower the people who attend our institute. We could empower them by getting them to be conversant with the new standards. And if they are, then they would have not the Bible, but a quasi-Bible of educational assessment. And they could refer to it, and they really are important. And because they just came out, this is an opportunity for us to pay attention to them. And if you could slip to the next slide, I would appreciate it. You'll find in these new standards considerable attention given to validity. Now, let's just talk for a moment about validity. I know that some of you are not measurement mavens and you don't get off on this stuff, but validity is, as the standards say, the most fundamental consideration in developing tests and evaluating tests. Now, here's the nature of validity. The validity the educational measurement people talk about is not the validity of a test. There is no such thing as a valid test, an invalid test. Validity instead refers to the inference or interpretation we draw for a specific use of a test. And then you'll see the second excerpt on the screen, that statements about validity should refer to particular interpretations for specific uses. Folks, they make that point again and again and again in a manner far more persuasive than in the 1999 joint standards. Now, what they're saying in essence is this. You have to have evidence of the accuracy of the interpretation for a particular use of a test. Now, accuracy of the interpretation, accuracy of the inference, Think about this for just a moment. We're playing with validity here. Validity focuses on an inference that you make about what you can't see. You want to know how much a kid knows about social studies or science. You want to make a judgment about what the kid knows about math or how well the kid can read. You cannot look at the child to come up with that interpretation. It's covert. It's inside the skull, going on in there somewhere. We don't know how. I guess these days we probably do know how, but for me, I don't know how. And so what you do is you have that covert thing that you're looking for, and you make an inference about what it is based on a kid's overt response to a test. Kids takes tests. Kid makes marks. Marks are scored. Judgments are made. Inferences are made about whether or not the kid can read, whether or not the kid can multiply or do division, and so on. These are all crucial things, and they focus on the inference, or as the new standards often refer to as the interpretation. But the new standards in a way that the previous standards did not specify, and here's an important distinction. The new standards say that this inference must be for a specified use. Now, a specified use, what this means is if you do not have evidence that the test is suitable for the specified use of evaluating a teacher, you damn well should not use that test. You should not use that test. And you can waive that book of standards in front of a judge or anyone else, or in front of a school board to show them that if you use the test to judge a teacher and there is no evidence to support the use of that test, then you have done violence. And if you move on to the next slide, please. Okay, for accurate evidence of a teacher's quality to be based on student growth data, the assessments being employed to gather such evidence must be instructionally sensitive. Can you see that? Can you see that if you're going to use students' test performances, pre-test, post-test, value-added, whatever, if you're going to use the student's performance to make an inference about the effectiveness of instruction, then the test must be instructionally sensitive. And if you don't have evidence for the instructional sensitivity of the test, how dare you use that to judge that teacher? That is, validity evidence should be at hand attesting to the instructional sensitivity of the test being used to collect teacher evaluation evidence. Without such validity evidence, student growth data are almost worthless. And that's the truth. I think what you have to realize, how can we then collect evidence about the instructional sensitivity of a test? And that's where we're going to head right next. And if you would please slip the next slide, I'd be in your debt forever. All right, here's a way that you will find out the extent to which a test is instructionally sensitive. And several people, I've looked at these slides when I can, when I'm not trying to recover from a blank screen, and I see that several of you raise the question, well, how can we tell if our tests are instructionally sensitive? How can we increase their instructional sensitivity? And here's, folks, where we have to borrow a message from the measurement community when it's set out to reduce the degree of assessment bias in our tests. Now, there's a real lesson to learn here. You go back 30 years ago. There wasn't much talk about assessment bias in tests. There really wasn't. I mean, I used to teach measurement courses at UCLA, and we'd have tests sent to us to use as kind of practice materials by some of the major testing outfits. And I remember one test, well, I can tell you exactly what it was. It was the Iowa Test of Basic Skills. And they sent a flock of these tests, and we had the technical manuals, and we looked through, and one of the ways they checked for assessment bias, that is bias against particular subgroups, they had 3 reviewers, one black, one white, Hispanic, and one Hispanic. And they had these 3 reviewers, and any item on which all 3 reviewers agreed that there was something wrong with the item, they would take the item out. Now, that was the limit of their assessment bias eradication back 30, 35 years ago. In other words, they didn't do a damn thing with it, really. It was just trivial, tokenism. And then people got serious about it. and they really wanted to remove the assessment bias from tests, and they did two important things. First, they had every single item used on a high-stake test withstand scrutiny from a review committee composed of experienced educators, usually representing the groups involved, African Americans, Latinos, men, women, and so on. And they reviewed an item, and they would ask questions saying, for example, if you look at an item, you say, based on the skill that this particular item or the knowledge that this particular item is supposed to represent, might a student be offended or unfairly penalized because of the student's personal characteristics, such as membership of a racial group or so on. In other words, we got really pretty darn good at reviewing tests for that purpose. We can do the same thing with instructional sensitivity, and I'll show you how in a second. The other way that we got rid of bias in the tests, or not got rid of it, but at least dramatically reduced it, was to subject those tests to empirical analyses. And what you did was, to be very simple, in the early years, we would simply look at the percent of kids who got it right, who were white kids, percent of kids who got it right, who were brown kids or black kids, and as a consequence of those disparities, we would go back and re-look at the particular items. Is there something in that item that would cause an African-American youngster to be disadvantaged or to be offended by the item? And as a consequence, we get rid of a lot of the bad items that way. But then what we do is we would actually subject those items empirically to a large-scale tryout. And we would discover which items had been answered worse or better than the various groups. We would then go back in and really scrutinize those items very carefully. Now, the technique used was called differential item functioning. You would literally have a statistical procedure, and it's developed and refined by now. When you had any item that was answered differentially by different subgroups, you'd go back in and verify whether the disparity between the way they answered was significantly large to warrant consideration. Now, we can do precisely the same thing for the instructional sensitivity of our tests. You could go back in to a test, and I think we're ready for the next slide, please. You could go back in to the test, and you could actually have a review committee, seasoned teachers who knew the kids' levels, who taught at that level, and so on. They could go through item by item, and they could be asked if a student had been taught with reasonable pedagogy to master the content standard or the goal that a given item was assessing, would it be likely that a substantial majority of those students could answer the item correctly? And you fundamentally would make that judgment based on what you knew about the kids and the item and how tough it was to teach, and you would also have been trained to make sure that the item did not contain socioeconomic bias, contained bias in the direction of inherited academic aptitudes, was not too tough, because it's so damn tough that no one can get it right. You can't raise kids' scores on it. So too darn easy. If it's so easy that everyone gets, in other words, there are ways you could look at the items such that you could trust those teachers' judgments to identify at least the items that appeared to be insensitive to instruction. And if that was the case, you get rid of them, just like we did with assessment biased items. Now, flip to the next screen, if you will.
Jim, before I do that, you might want to think about Tad's question that just came in. He's asking what you just described, how is that different from what many states are doing with teacher committees reviewing items?
It's not. It's fundamentally the same thing. What you make sure is that the charge given to this review committee, and it could be the same committee as another committee, the charge given to this review committee, and you'd orient them, you tell them what to look for, and so on. Fundamentally, you're asking, for example, to spot any items that are really IQ items posing as achievement items. You're asking the reviewers to spot any items that are more linked to a kid's richness of background than to how well the kid was taught. You're getting these people ready to make a judgment about whether, if the kids were taught reasonably well, not with the skill of Socrates, but just reasonably well, would most of them get the damn question right. It's just that simple. And this would parallel precisely the way that we began to eliminate biased items from our achievement tests, and why we're much better at it now. Okay? To the next slide.
Okay. There you go.
Now, here's the analog to the empirical method. And you can't use this really in a classroom or in a small district, because you have to have enough teachers. But you could surely do it at the state level. You could absolutely do it at the state level. What you do is you identify two groups of outlier teachers. That is, teachers who are exceptionally successful and exceptionally unsuccessful based on their students' performance over several years in a row. And you get these two groups of teachers. You don't call them effective and ineffective to judge them. You call them effective and ineffective just to judge the items. And then what you do is you contrast the performance of their kids, their students, on items taught by these outlier groups. And again, what you're looking for is items where it does not turn out the way you anticipated. You know, if you've got these super teachers, their kids ordinarily should be getting items right more frequently than kids taught by the less effective teachers. And if you don't get those kinds of results, then you go back and look at what's going on with the item. Now, the fact is that this is an absolute analog to the technique you would use when you're trying to get rid of assessment bias in items. And you can use differential item functioning just as readily as that approach. Now, when you combine these two approaches, and you do this one only when you have a large enough sample, a large enough number of teachers and so on to do, when you combine these two, you could do a tremendously important job at supplying evidence of instructional sensitivity for large-scale tests. If you just did it for your local school, and indeed for yourself, this would be helpful. This would reduce the number of items that are posing as achievement items in these tests, but are actually measuring different things. So I'm very enthused about the possibility of using those two approaches, and I think indeed you could use it. Okay, we're almost at a point, Elizabeth, where we have to deal with questions, but you have this pondering pause first.
We do. We have a few more things to take care of, and I think we've been answering folks' questions throughout, but we'll make sure we leave a little bit of time for any lingering questions. But for now, we have one for you all. You see on the screen, I'll give you just a moment to read that. So, based on what you just heard described regarding the judgmental or empirical evidence, we're going to be asking you to respond to which one of these you would recommend and why. So you'll see the poll come up again. And Jim, while they're responding to that, there's still a few more things in the parking lot. Carol asked a follow-up question to what we were discussing a little while back. When you talked about the judgmental method, she's asking, isn't that also used to set cut scores?
Well, Carol, the whole notion of how you go about setting cut scores has been studied a lot over the last 20 or 30 years, and we're better at it. It's still a judgmental enterprise. It's still subject to error, but I would trust some of the methodologies being used now rather widely a lot more than just sitting down and having a group of people, you know, pick it out of thin air. The methodology associated with standard setting is really important. It was just done very recently for the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium test, and they had an online review group of something like 2,500 people suggesting different cut scores for the Smarter Balance test. Then it went to 500 plus in-person committee members, just identical to the one I'm talking about now, and they met down in Dallas, and then finally it went to kind of an articulation panel who looked to make sure that the individual grade level groups hadn't set cut scores that are way out of whack with the rest of them, and that was about, I think, 60 or 70 folks in addition. So, I mean, they really did it well, and the methodology they used was quite striking. And so, given that methodology, I'm sure they came up with a set of cut scores that are about as defensible as you can come up with, and that can be done for any test.
Alrighty, so looking over at the responses to the question, we are somewhat split on this.
What's the split?
We're about 50-50, and I'm not counting exactly. They're still coming in, but we have some folks who believe empirical and others who are saying judgmental. More of our judgmental folks are giving their rationale. So Tab says judgmental has greater potential for embedded professional development for participants. Dodie says that judgmental could likely teach people to evaluate instructional sensitivity of items more quickly than studying groups over time or field testing items prior to use on assessment.
Well, let me add my comment too. If you're in a small group situation, let's say you're in a district in I don't know, Gladstone, Oregon. It's just down the road from me. If you're in a small district, you really only have one option, and that option is judgmental. If you were to create district tests or even school tests, and you wanted to do a meaningful job at trying to eradicate instructionally insensitive items, about the only recourse available to you is judgmental. But if you were in a position where you could influence a state, your state department, your state chief school officer, to have more defensible tests, then you got to go both. You have to go both. You have to get both of those kinds of evidence in there. It's, you know, what's so troubling to me, Elizabeth, is that as a field, we end up sometimes accused of repudiating the evidence of the very thing we say we're trying to do, promote student learning. In the state of Washington, for example, just north of where I live, the teachers' organization put on considerable pressure and did not allow their legislature to pass a law which would call for using student test scores as about 5%, 5, not 50, 5% of the teacher evaluation. What on earth could have made them take that stance? If you have the right kinds of tests, I mean instructionally sensitive tests in there, and that means you're getting valid inferences about which teachers are good or bad, by golly, those tests ought to play a major role, or certainly a 5% role. But we reject these things because we don't know how to make them better. And what I'm suggesting to you folks on the webinar is if you're local, then go with the local review operation, a review committee similar to the bias review committees that have been so successful in this country. And if you are influential in any way in what goes on in your state, demand that there be some kind of empirical verification that these test items are more than just items made to spread out examinees. These are items that tell you how well kids have been taught.
And I think that kind of ties up some of the last comments here. You know, folks asking, is there a way to do both? And your suggestion is that there is a situation in the context for each. And then someone else is asking in the parking lot about some of your lessons learned from your work in Wyoming in terms of the time and the cost of developing instructionally sensitive assessments.
Well, the cost is manageable. because it doesn't add a lot of additional cost. If you think about it, we review tests right now for assessment bias. We chuck out the ones that display it. We could review assessments for instructional sensitivity and chuck out the ones that are insensitive. So it doesn't cost a whale of a lot more money. The shortcoming here is on knowledge of what to look for. It's not only a lack of knowledge, but a lack of zeal. What you may remember early on in our time together, I said I wanted you to think this is important enough to do something about it, and I think that's your challenge now. Okay, Elizabeth.
Well, and that was right into our summary slides, and if you want to quickly go through these next two slides and just wrap up, we can then ask folks one more question and leave a few minutes for them to ask their remaining burning questions.
I got that quickly. I understand the meaning of that adverb. I taught English. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, very quickly, what we did is we looked at what instructional sensitivity was. And I wanted you to understand very definitely the impact that the Army Alpha had, and what it created among assessment personnel was a need for score spread. And because of that, what you get is tests often that don't measure instructional impact. Comparative versus instructional foci of educational tests, I try to argue that there is a need for tests that do have an instructional mission. We looked at the two federal initiatives that spurred teacher evaluation, and I've got to tell you, just as kind of a footnote to our time together, I've been disappointed with the way that states have followed through on this. I do not think we have gained the real improvements in the caliber of teacher evaluation that I was hoping for. The 2014 Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing could be a catalyst for improvement in this sort, and then two kinds of validity assessment evidence to bear on instructional sensitivity are just as with assessment bias, judgmental and empirical, and if you're at a state level, you can go for both, and that is a summary of that. How about the next slide? And here are our two intended outcomes. At this point, you will find on your front door a drone that has dropped off a post-test, and that post-test will give you a multiple choice items that measure all this. What I suggested at the outset, I really did want you to understand what instructional sensitivity is, to defend why it really is so significant in evaluating teachers, and explain how to increase it if you're at the district or maybe at the state level. And I truly, desperately want you to do all those things, and I'm through with that, Elizabeth.
All right, Jim, thank you.
He said quickly.
And you delivered. So this next section, we're going to pop up the two poll boxes. We end each of our webinars asking folks to discuss their takeaways from the presentation and action steps. And as Jim charged you all with this action item, we would like to find out, and hopefully you can share across folks on the line, what you intend to do with today's information. And while you all are answering that, we'll go back to the parking lot and try to respond to these last few questions, and folks can continue to post questions if you still have them. So moving back up here, Jim, Tad is asking about, do you have any notion of how many states have the data sets required to link student scores to teachers in a consistent fashion? First part, and then how would you adjust for the effect of earlier teachers on identifying your outliers?
Oh, I think you could find that in almost any state, Tad, with a reasonable population. I mean, it'd be tougher to do it in Wyoming than it would be in Illinois. But if you have existing data at the State Department, you could clearly identify those who have been, we use the notion of student growth percentiles. A number of states are using these. It's easy to spot teachers whose student growth percentiles exceeded from year to year that which you expect of them, and who fell behind year to year. So you could literally find that in almost any heavy population state.
Okay, and Cynthia's asking if there are any studies or documentation of where the empirical evidence approach has been used.
No, because there's not a lot of places where it's been used. You see, Cynthia, no one is screaming for this. No one is saying, even though the new standards make it imperative to do this, no one is saying, you damn well use this test, you damn well better have evidence that it's appropriate for it. People ought to be screaming that, but they're not, and so no, we don't have any places where it's been used.
All right, and looking over here at some of the takeaways, I think folks had some aha moments. Teacher evaluations need an overhaul. This changed the perspective on validity. Really taking a harder look at how we assess students.
Elizabeth, let me add one little point. I'm a member of the National Assessment Governing Board. That's the outfit that oversees the NAEP test. And they have a new initiative going, NAGB, in conjunction with National Council Center on Education Statistics. And it's an assessment literacy campaign. An assessment literacy campaign aimed not at teachers, not at school administrators, but at parents, at policymakers like board members, and at students themselves, trying to teach Americans more about the essentials of educational assessment. I'm very optimistic about the payoff of that, and if it really happens, and it's just getting underway, in a year or so, you might be in a position where you could play a role in getting those groups, that is, parents and policymakers and kids, more assessment literate. It wouldn't be a bad thing.
I think that's a good piece of information. Is there anywhere people can access any preliminary work on that?
It's so preliminary. I mean, we're talking about the early months, but go 6 months and then go to the NAGB website, NAGB.
Okay. Shelby's asking, was there a report developed for the work in Wyoming that could be shared publicly?
Yeah. If you go to the Wyoming website and click on their PAWS, PAWS, Proficiency Assessment for Wyoming Students, there are reports on that, and what they found was they began to get really positive results from the testing program, and then a new superintendent was elected.
And it looks like Shelby was able to find that link for us.
I have a daughter named Shelby. She's really bad at math.
I'm sure she would appreciate you mentioning that.
Oh, yeah.
So looking back over here, some action steps. Let's share through a few of those before we wrap up today. Folks who want to participate more in assessment design and development, being a critical consumer, keeping informed of what their states are doing, talking more to others about this work, getting their hands on the new standards.
That's a really good, that's an excellent idea. I mean, it's just, they can be very empowering because the courts pay attention to them.
And Jim, an earlier question about the standards, is there a specific section that if folks really are limited in time, could they focus on one particular section that you think would have the most impact for them?
Yes, it would be on validity. Validity is the big bopper underlying construct that makes all the difference in all that we do in educational testing, and it's a very well-written section on validity. Yeah, and if any of you actually happen to get a copy of that book, it's readable. I mean, it's not just for the quantitatively exotic. It's very easy to understand.
And a few folks here who are servicing teachers and believe this is good information that they're going to try to digest and share in professional learning situations.
Well, I want to thank you, Elizabeth, for doing a really nice job at looking at multiple screens and making, you are a multitask lady for sure.
Well, we thank you, Jim, for your time today, and I'd like to, at this moment, give everyone the opportunity to give you a virtual round of applause.
High-pitched whistles are really make an impression.
Well, unfortunately, I'm the only one here, and I don't know how to whistle, so I'm not going to do a good job of that. But I bet the folks on the line could be creative and give you some virtual whistles.
Thank you.
And thanks for adding a little humor to an otherwise heavy topic. And I know folks out there probably appreciate that as well. So we're going to pull those 2 polls off. I'm going to go through a few little housekeeping things.
Am I excused?
Well, we need you here for just a moment further,
Okay.
just in
Okay.
case there's any last questions. If you do need to contact either myself or Jim, here's our information. You can contact me with any questions about the REL series, and you can contact Jim about any questions related to today's topic or anything related to his work.
I also answer questions about personal relations. If you're having trouble with a significant other, I can deal with that.
That's great to know, Jim. Thanks for sharing. And as was earlier mentioned, we have the forums on teacher effectiveness where you can go to continue this conversation and others from our other topics. I also put in the plug for our next Ask an Expert webinar that will happen early next month, and that's on the topic of student surveys. So please come back and talk with us about that topic. And finally, we really value your feedback. We want to make sure that this series serves your needs and that the REL Mid-Atlantic is doing what they can to serve our stakeholder needs. So you'll be asked to complete this evaluation. We hope you'll just take a few minutes before you leave to do that. And we hope you all have a great night, and thanks a lot for coming.